Hi there, welcome to the latest edition of The Front Page. I hope you're well. Loads of strong stuff in this week's show, including a colossal edition of the Tattersalls October Yearling Sale Book 1. Huge money flying around there. We'll be looking at a big money story which could be desperate news for betting and racing, with the prospect or possibility of a tax raid on the gambling sector in this month's budget. And we'll be looking back on 2 fascinating days at Newmarket, which unexpectedly were headed by a story linked to the Cesarewitch, whose definitive winner we still do not yet know. My name is Lee Mottershead, I know that. I also know that joining me on the show this week are in the studio, Jonathan Harding, hello.
Morning, Lee, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. More of that in a minute. And in Ireland, at his home, David Jennings, who is in great order, I'm sure, DJ?
I am. Terrific. Good to be here.
Yeah, good weekend?
Great weekend, yeah. Very enjoyable, yeah. I had yesterday off, so got to do a good bit with the kids and, batteries recharged, ready for the week.
Fantastic. How are your batteries?
Yeah, partially recharged.
Partially.
Having walked Hadrian's Wall last week.
All of it?
All of it. So I had my feet up at the weekend watching the racing, which was quite nice. So yeah, getting back to 100%.
So how long is that then?
84 miles.
84 miles. Right, okay. And did you sleep in a tent?
Tents, yeah.
Did you really?
Yeah, would not recommend that bit, but the walk was lovely.
Okay, well done. No tents required for this particular edition. We're going to start with the sales last week in Newmarket. The Tattersalls October Yearling Sale Book 1 is the most prestigious, the highest profile of all the yearling sales in Europe. It generally delivers fireworks. You've got to use the word fireworks in relation to big money sales. And it certainly did on this occasion, thanks in no small part to Joorabchian, the front man of Ammo Racing, a racing operation that gets bigger and bigger, and is set to get much bigger as a result of Kia's purchases at last week's sales. In terms of the numbers, he spent more than £24 million on 25 yearlings, some of them in conjunction with Anthony Rams and Sheikh Joanne Al Thani and Evangelos Marinakis, a fellow high-profile figure from the world of football. The buys included a Frankel filly for £4.62 million, making that for the second most expensive yearling ever sold in Europe, and a Wootton Bassett colt who cost £4.52 million, and that made him the most expensive yearling colt ever sold in Europe. Speaking after the sales, Mr. Joorabchian explained that his policy, his motivation for that spending spree was to make Ammo competitive with the superpowers of the racing and bloodstock game. He believes he needs to spend big to do that, and he certainly did last week. And he wasn't alone as well. Despite selling 12% fewer horses compared to last year, the combined value of all the yearlings sold in the ring at Tats last week was 34% greater than in 2023. Some numbers here: 345 yearlings bought in the ring fetched over £134 million, up from £100 million last year. The median grew from £262,500 from £189,000, and the average grew from £256,000 to £389,000. Those numbers again helped in no small part by that spending spree by Joorabchian. And Jonathan Harding, Kia clearly was the one who was making the most headlines there. We normally associate Book 1 of the October sale as a battle between, generally, Coolmore and Godolphin, who go head-to-head for a lot of purchases. Godolphin did spend big again this year, more so than Coolmore, but it was Ammo, it was Joorabchian who stole the show, not for the first time. Did it take you by surprise?
A little bit. I think we weren't expecting that level of spend necessarily. From what we've heard from Kieran with the way that he approaches racing, he's clearly very ambitious and has his own way of doing things with Ammo, and it's an aspirational ownership group, but I don't think anybody necessarily anticipated Ammo going toe-to-toe with Godolphin and Coolmore in the way that it did at the sales. I have kind of two views on this. That on one hand, it's fantastic that we have another major investor pumping in that level of money at the top end of the sport, that has to be good news.
Yep.
And sort of upsetting the established order a little bit as well in terms of competition and
Disruptor.
storylines. Yeah, it's great. You need that. And Watnan to an extent has done that, but this is probably a more private entity coming in and doing it, which is promising to see. On the flip side, I do find it slightly incongruous with the state of British racing generally. I think it perhaps gives a slightly false impression of the state of the sport's finances. I'd hate for somebody from the outside looking in to think, well, that sport must be thriving because look at the money being thrown around at the top end. That is a very different situation and almost a different sport to what's happening at the bottom end in terms of sort of prize money and the money being put in. So, yeah, really interesting story anyway, and it'd make a great soap opera, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that point you made about the potential for a false perception of what this tells us about British racing and British breeding will be particularly relevant when we come on to your story later in the show. But I made the same point in my column today, highlighting that at some point, even aside from the tax story that we're going on to, we know the BHA and racing leaders want to go back to government and ask them to reopen the move towards getting levy reform that almost happened before the general election. And the danger is that government sees headlines of a yearling sale that fetched £134 million in revenue. They will say, well, how is that? Can that be a sport that is potentially on its knees and that is suffering? But clearly, the money that came through TATS last week isn't a reflection on how British racing and breeding is doing. It is at the top end where they live in a parallel universe, completely different world. There's also no formal funding link between the sales and the sport, so British Racing plc does not benefit in any way collectively from what happened at TATS last week. And we know that when we get into the second half of this week and we have books 3 and 4 of the October yearling sale, I suspect that the stories and the headlines coming out of those will be much less positive.
Yeah, and I still think it's a net positive, this investment in the top end.
Oh, yeah,
I think it is still I wouldn't like to take away from the fact that it is fantastic to see that level of investment, but Book One has always been its own little world, really detached from the rest. This is the elite of the elite in terms of bloodstock, and the sums are eye-watering in the same way that transfers for Premier League players are slightly jarring relative to transfers for players in the National League. That is a pyramid and it works as such. But yeah, I do find the optics interesting, let's put it that way.
DJ, Ammo and Joorabchian are an entity in Ireland as well as in Britain. Have had real success in Ireland too. What was your take on his attempt to really muscle in into that sort of superpower territory at the sales?
Yeah, I think with Kia, he was either going to go completely one way or completely the other. I think he's the type of guy who's either going to go completely out of the sport or he's going to try and be the best in the sport. So when I saw the action at the sales, I was like, okay, yes, we've got our definitive answer here anyway, because even in his quotes afterwards, the amount of times he mentions Group 1s, the amount of times he mentions the top races, the top pedigrees, the top stallions, he wants to be competing on a regular basis in Group 1s. And I know obviously King of Steel has been their flag bearer over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, we haven't seen enough of him, but he's obviously set to go to stud either, probably next year, I'd imagine. And they've got Bucanero Fuerte, who could turn out to be a decent stallion as well, as a Group 1 winner too. But they obviously needed to add to their long-term strategy. And I think that's the key thing here, because what's going to happen now is the money that's been spent on these fillies in particular means that, Key is going to be in this game for a long time, whether he likes it or not now. And that level of spending, obviously at that level, can only be a good thing. But it does obviously add another dimension to the whole Coolmore Godolphin mix. And it's going to be very, very interesting. I thought it was interesting even to see prices coming out for Ammo to be winning classics in 2026 and whether it would happen or not. And it's a big gamble, but he thinks it's the right gamble and that they've done the research, they've ran the stats, they know what they need to do to get to the next level. And to get to the next level, you need to be getting that checkbook out, and that's what they've done.
Yeah, it certainly did. One other interesting thing we should probably raise is when he was explaining why he was spending so much, he referenced the foal share situation that often happens around sales, whereby a stud will offer a free nomination to a stallion and then in effect take a 50% interest in that stallion when it's sold. He spoke about Kia saying that there are 3 or 4 big groups, because then we have to pay over the odds because they're paying 50 cents to the dollar on a horse because they're on a foal share. Now, I know I spoke to at least one of those big groups over the weekend and they said it's nowhere near that straightforward. It's much more complicated than that. But he said, I'd like to see a situation where there are lots of owners who enjoy big days out. That's clearly a laudable ambition, and not just 1 or 2 groups. In order to do that, you have to have a fair and balanced system. Now, saying that indicates that he believes what we have at the moment is not a fair and balanced system. So he really is trying to disrupt that system in more ways than one.
Yeah, it's lovely to see a little bit of needle in there and a little bit of he's a competitive person clearly. From sort of limited dealings with him, it's very obvious that he's not afraid to speak his mind and put the cat amongst the pigeons, as it were. And I think from the first part of his quote, it's interesting because he strikes me as someone who has the power to bring more people in. I mean, he's shown that already, but with his links in the world of football, I think he's somebody who can actually bring a few more people into the fold, which has to be a good thing.
Yeah, and we'll find out more once these very, very, very valuable yearlings become 2-year-olds and start racing next year. We had some cracking 2-year-old racing over the 2 days at Newmarket. More on that in a second, but first of all, news on Racing Post Insider. Welcome back to the front page. We're talking action on the track now. It was the Future Champions Festival at Newmarket on Friday, Saturday. We had the Fillies Mile, we had the Dewhurst Stakes, but we also had David Jennings, the Cesarewitch, which ended up making most of the headlines.
It did. It did. What a load of nonsense, my God. Right, I'll choose my words carefully. Well, basically, Alphonse Le Grande was first past the post, even though watching the race live, I thought he might be third past the post, but he was first past the post, and he was on the day officially your Cesarewitch winner of 2024. Very soon after the race, like very, very soon after the race, news emerged and people started spotting that Jamie Powell could be in breach of, well, was definitely in breach of whip rules one way or the other, but could have reached that 4 over the limit mark of 10 on Alphonse Le Grande, and under the newish whip rules, that would mean disqualification. So what we have now is a complete and utter mess. A mess that lessons need to be learned from this, because this cannot continue. You cannot have a situation where you have one of the biggest races, biggest handicaps of the season, arguably the biggest stay-in handicap. Well, it certainly used to be before the prize money was reduced. But you cannot have a situation where you're leaving Newmarket on Saturday and you don't know who's actually won the race. It is utterly... the mind boggles how this could have happened. I can see why the BHA have tried to do what they've done. Put it this way, I don't necessarily have anything massively wrong with the actual ruling. Although Steve Mellish didn't, my hero, I have to say, my hero, Steve Mellish did make a very good point in Racing TV yesterday. He said, how can it be perfectly fine to hit a horse 6 times, but it can't be okay to hit it 10 times? It's either right, or if we're saying the whip is okay, we can say it's completely not okay for 10 times, but perfectly fine for 6 times, which I think when you actually sit back and actually listen to those words, you say, actually, yeah, that makes perfect sense. How can it be horrific for it to hit a horse 10 times, but perfectly fine to hit a horse 6 times? Like, it's almost either the whip is right or it's wrong, and you can judge whether there has been, mistakes made by a jockey during a race. Anyway, that's one point. But like how you can let a result stand on the day, let connection celebrate, and one of the key angles here that needs to be discussed is, especially for future ramifications, how the market can be settled on Alphonse Le Grande winning the race and the second Manxman, who was well supported into, I think, 11-2 at the off, how they don't get paid and Alphonse Le Grande's backers do get paid is just astonishing. And people are saying, and I've heard people make the case time and time again, saying that, but sure would be, you couldn't do it on the day. You can't do it on the day because it takes so long and you have to look at the strikes and blah, blah, blah. And in fairness, I know Kevin Blake has pointed out on Twitter that Jamie Powell's last strike mightn't necessarily have actually connected with the horse. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens on Tuesday. But if you're able to sort out an extremely difficult Stewart's inquiry on the day, you surely should be able to count the amount of strokes that a winning horse has been given by a jockey. It's not rocket science. I know there could be issues like we have with Jamie where, the last strike is kind of, did he hit the horse or not? Well, then that is something that can be referred to Tuesday. But you say, look, we think you've hit the horse 10 times. You are disqualified. You can appeal this and we'll hear it on Tuesday. But it looks to us in the steward's room like you've hit the horse 10 times, so you're disqualified. So that's it. You can't. How can you have a situation where we don't know who's won the Cesarewitch until Tuesday? It needs to be sorted out on the daily. And I don't subscribe to the theory that it would take too long on the day. If we're able to get around Stewart's inquiries and able to make really difficult decisions, like really, really difficult decisions in Stewart's inquiries in the space of 15 minutes, if we can do that in 15 minutes, we can count the number of strikes a winner has been given in 15 minutes.
DJ, I think you're absolutely right, yeah. I have personally, I've got no issues at all with Alphonse Le Grande being disqualified if the jockey has hit the horse 10 times. It looked to the naked eye like the jockey had hit the horse 10 times. You can argue for hours about whether the rules are right or wrong, but it seems to me that if the rules say that you can only hit the horse 6 times in a flat race and he's hit the horse 10 times, then I've got no problems with that horse being disqualified. But it does seem to me bewildering that you have a situation whereby we all left Newmarket on Saturday, or TV viewers finished watching the programme, not knowing who was going to ultimately be the winner of the Cesarewitch. It seems bizarre to me that you can have one result for punters and a different result for connections. And John, you spoke to Simon Crisford, didn't you, over the weekend, who trained the second Manxman. I remember at Newmarket on Saturday, he walked past me after the race, just saying, we tried. That was before this all came around. Of course, ultimately, he might win the race because the jockey on Alphonse Le Grande tried too hard on his horse. But Simon is interesting because he was actually quite bold in what he said.
He was, but he was also measured as well. I think he, straight off the bat, recognised the fact that this isn't an easy situation.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have sat down for a long time to come up with the application of the rules that we have now, which is that it's delayed and any disqualifications handled by or potential disqualifications handled by the Whip Review Committee. But the leap that people have to make is from pointing out that this is wrong, the way that the rules are applied, which I think a lot of people, myself included, think this doesn't sit right. Then it's actually coming up with a better alternative. That is the problem. In an ideal world, it would be sorted on the day. I think everybody agrees that. It's just working out how it can be sorted on the day in such a manner that it doesn't cause complete chaos. Everybody naturally then goes to, technology, because every other sport has. We have Hawkeye, we have TMO, we have VAR, we have these. Well, VAR is probably not the best example because that brings its own problems. And I think sorting out on the day would bring its own problems. But yeah, I think just generally, I think the rule is fine. It's the way that it's applied with this delay doesn't really suit anybody, not least punters, which is the group that racing can ill afford to put off anymore.
Just on that, Johnny, you're saying about, trying to sort it out on the day, okay? And I hear people saying, you have to watch all 30 riders or whatever in the race. You don't. Like, you could have somebody there on the day, their specific job and their only job on the day is to count the strikes. and they count the strikes. Like, if you put it this way, right? If you knew nothing about horse racing and you asked a sports person or anybody, it doesn't even have to be anybody involved in sports, which would be harder to solve or which would take longer to solve? Figuring out how many times maybe the first, second, and third horses in a race have been struck by a whip, or figuring out interference and whether it has an impact on the outcome, and sorting out a finish in that regard, or counting the number of strikes. They would pick counting the number of strikes every single day over the week over trying to sort out an interference inquiry. So how we can make this argument saying, oh, it's going to take all day, my God. Sure, we'd be there for hours. People would be turning off the lights and we'd be still trying to sort it out. Nonsense.
Yeah, again, I agree completely. DJ, I want to ask Jonathan a question about the Cesarewitch prize winning second. But before we do that, what was your take on the two Group 1 winners at Newmarket? So Shadow of Light, a horse who we thought after Middle Park Stakes was purely a sprinter, turns out not to be purely a sprinter, and overhauled two rivals in the closing stages of a Dewhurst run without the line in winter, and his Charlie Appleby trained stable companion Desert Flower, who was really impressive in the Fillies Mile on Friday.
I don't feel very patriotic here, but as an Irishman, I absolutely adore both of them. Desert Flower, first of all. It's seldom you see a horse like Desert Flower, filly in this case, where there are a couple of strides mid-race. Like, you're talking 3.5 furlongs out where you go, uh-oh, God, she could be beaten here. And for her to win in the manner she did, like, I love Ron Wood, one of our chief analysis writers here. I thought he was harsh on Desert Flower in his analysis. I can't remember the exact wording, I'll get it before the end of the show, but it was almost like there wasn't a wow factor to it. For the margin of victory may have been quite substantial, but there wasn't really a wow factor. I couldn't disagree more. I thought it was wow. It was, oh my God, this filly is only just getting going. Like, I thought to go from where she was 3 out to win the race she did at the line was exceptional. And there may be a few utterly exceptional fillies at the moment, 2-year-old fillies going into next year's classics, Lake Victoria, Fairy Godmother. You've obviously got the French filly as well. So it could be a really good fillies classics next season. But after watching that on Saturday, Desert Flower would be towards the top of my pecking order. Probably at the top of my pecking order, not towards the top, at the top. Desert Flower would be for the 1,000 guineas. Moving on to Saturday, look, it was a real, punch in the stomach when we heard on Saturday morning that the Line in Winter was out. I think the Line in Winter would have won the Dewhurst convincingly. That's my take on it. Given the horse that Ryan rode, given how close that got at the line, I'd imagine there's absolutely no comparison between that horse and the Line in Winter. But in saying that, for Shadow of Light, as I said in my piece afterwards, where it was kind of, what was your top juvenile performance from the day on Saturday? There could only be one juvenile performance in my eyes, because for everything to go wrong for Shadow of Light, and for the horse to still have enough raw ability to win the race, to be on the wrong side and to switch and win a race, takes some doing. And I thought William Buick's comments afterwards very interesting, where he said when he did switch and he got into that competitive edge and got into that street fighter mode that he has, he really wanted it. And it looked that way, like he had every chance to shirk the issue and he didn't. Whether he's good enough to win a Guineas, whether he'll stay well enough to win a Guineas, I don't know. But he's certainly a very fair price. I think there was 12 to 1 available after the race. I don't know whether he will beat the Line in Winter or whether he'll ever beat the Line in Winter. Probably not. But I think we have to upgrade that Dewhurst performance massively.
Yeah, if anything, he almost looked like he won with greater stamina in the closing stages of the race. It was bizarre. John, before we move on, I just wanted, we've spoken a lot on this programme and written a lot in the Racing Post this year about the Jockey Club's difficult financial situation. We know a lot of that links to the underperformance of the Cheltenham Festival. They announced prize money cuts and gave back some Premier race days. I made the point in the piece on Saturday that the Cesarewitch appears to be a good case in point of how things are there at the moment. 2018, the race was worth £500,000 after a prize money injection with a view to it becoming a £1 million race. That didn't happen because of, at that point, it was because of fears for betting shop closures due to changes in the FOBT stakes. If you take out the COVID year, The Cesarewitch prize money has gone from £500,000 to £350,000 to £250,000 to £200,000 to £175,000 on Saturday, making it the least valuable Cesarewitch since it was run for £160,000 in 2012. Coming just after it was announced that the Jockey Club had sold Criterion Stakes Day to York from next year, a transaction that one might have expected, one might think would have banked them a seven-figure sum, £1 million plus. It underlines that these aren't easy times for the Jockey Club, and they're having to make some tough decisions.
I think that's exactly right, and you'd hope that they'd draw a very thick red line in permanent marker at the current prize money and say we simply can't go any further below that, because I think that would be catastrophic for such a historic race. But yeah, it's like a canary in the mine a little bit. It shows you the general state of British racing when a racecourse group like that is having to rationalise and make, no doubt, very difficult decisions it would rather not be making. But such was the performance of the Cheltenham Festival and that group's reliance on that meeting that they've had to make some very difficult decisions. And with betting turnover dropping and a lot of other key markers going south, I don't know why anyone would be that surprised.
John references difficult decisions there. The racing and betting sectors are going to be watching and waiting hard now as they wait to see what Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, does in terms of a difficult decision, in terms of how she fills the so-called £22 billion black hole in the UK's finances. And John, it's become apparent that one thing that is being discussed would be potentially catastrophically damaging to British racing.
Yeah, I've slightly lost count of the amount of times I've had to sit here and talk about blows to British racing's finances, but kind of hot off the heels of affordability checks under the Conservative government and the financial hole that's been blown by that. It's potentially more bad news, I'm afraid, with a report in The Guardian on Friday claiming that Treasury officials are considering essentially a tax raid on the gambling sector. They're weighing up some proposals from think tanks essentially to try and raise up to £3 billion through raising gambling duties in order to basically chip away at that £22 billion black hole. One of the proposals, which is by the Institute for Public Policy Research, is called for general betting duty, which is bookmakers' profits from sports betting, to be doubled to 30%, and for remote gaming duty to rise to 50%. So from 21%, yes. So these are potentially big rises. Whether they actually happen in that form remains to be seen. You wouldn't imagine necessarily it would get up to that level. But what we're talking about again is another blow to bookmakers' finances, which in turn, through that symbiotic relationship, has an impact on racing's finances, because you'd be looking at these large bookmaker groups and the share prices in them have dropped this morning, it's worth adding, Monday morning, that they will then look at racing and think, well, they'll look at their whole product suite holistically, and they'll look at which parts are performing and which aren't, and logically, if their profits are impacted, then they're going to have to cut back somewhere, and that could lead to less sponsorship and promotion of racing, and ultimately less value for customers as well. So were it to come into play at that top end, I think it would be massively, massively concerning for racing.
And Julie Harrington, the BHA Chief Executive, has responded to these reports and made that point that the government really has to think hard about what it does because of potential unintended consequences to British racing. The Betting and Gaming Council has made the same point. There'll be those who say, well, if the government just looks at a rise on the gaming duty, that's all good, but of course it's not, because if bookmakers end up with making less profits, they will look to make cuts elsewhere. Racing could well be a big sufferer in that. It sort of ties in as well to a point I was making in the column today about it became apparent last week again that betting turnover on British racing continues to fall, a 20% drop over the last 2 years. We've already seen bookmakers react to that by reducing the number of offers they put forward to punters, by betting to margins that are poorer for punters, making the betting product less attractive. That's already hurting British racing, and the worry on that front is that there isn't any obvious reason why things are going to get better. The demographic of people who bet on racing tends to be older people who also bet more on racing than younger people do. As they die off, we're going to need probably 4 times as many younger people to replace each one that dies. We haven't really got any sort of meaningful marketing budget to promote or sell the sport or racing as a betting product, so it's hard to see how things are going to improve. The last thing we therefore need is a tax rate on bookmakers.
That's cheerful stuff.
Yeah.
Monday
morning, hey!
It feels a little bit like death by 1,000 cuts at the minute, and if it's not coming from one direction, it's the other. But it's perfectly logical. It makes sense if you are running one of these massive bookmaking giants and you're sat in your office, wherever that might be, and you're looking at racing over here with falling betting turnover, and you're looking at all your other products that might be actually going the right way. Where are you going to consolidate? It's a fact of life. It's disappointing. It's just disappointing to have a situation whereby racing's been suffered a lot of collateral already from government policy through the gambling review and affordability checks. The idea that it might now get struck with a jab from the other side is really disappointing. Look, it's worth noting that this is just reported at the moment.
Yeah.
But I suppose if you're a politician, it's fairly low-hanging fruit. I don't think there'll be a huge public outcry for people taxing bookmakers. It just feels like a fairly easy win in terms of public opinion, wider public opinion. It's just racing now has to, as it has done through Julie Harrington and will continue to do, just stress the fact that we're over here and we're going to suffer massively if you bring this in.
Yeah, DJ, it's not as though the news is much better in Ireland. We seem to talk about this on the show every week, but even since the last edition, the gambling regulation bill seems to be creeping ever closer to reality, which would be, again, potentially extremely damaging to Irish racing. We know Sky Sports Racing is planning to have its own special Irish feed. We've not yet heard definitively what Racing TV would plan to do, but it can only be bad news, you'd think.
Yeah, I think it's a case of just looking for solutions now, Lee. I think we have to accept it and looking for solutions to a problem we hoped wouldn't surface, but it has. And, you know, the bill has been signed and it's signed, sealed and delivered. And now it's basically just finding a solution to a problem that could have been easily rectified, but there's no point, you know, crying over spilt milk now. We've been crying for the last year anyway. So... yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. It's obviously very different for Sky Sports Racing compared to Racing TV. You know, different companies, different sizes, and what Racing TV are going to do now, we just have to watch this space. But yeah, it's very, very disappointingly.
Yeah, we wait and we will hopefully discover some news soon on that one. Okay, end of the show. My job now, as ever, is to determine a winning story. Any of those could be winning stories. They're all really big stories. Any of them would have been a number one story in most weeks. And we'll just say, though, because of its potential catastrophic consequences, we'll say, John, your story on the tax situation, which we obviously hope, as lovers of British racing, the Chancellor will think hard about before any decision is made. I hope you've enjoyed the show, albeit there haven't been that many laughs in it on this occasion. We hope you enjoy your racing week. Champions Day to look forward to on Saturday. No doubt that will be a discussion point on the programme next week. Until then, though, with my thanks to David Jennings and to Jonathan Harding, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.